Welcome to Mind Set Money 11, the channel that opens your mind to success, wealth, and freedom day one. Thank you for taking the time to listen to the story. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe to our channel. We appreciate it and thank you in advance. Please leave the name of the city you're listening from in the comments section below. It helps us see our reach in the community.
Now, let's start the story. Chris was a fence and decking contractor who had just started a new 3D printing business out of his home. When the news reports hit, strange things were happening and people were violently attacking each other. Strange videos surfaced on YouTube that looked like dead people attacking live humans, biting chunks of meat from their necks and arms. Chris has always wondered what it would be like if the Walking Dead show ever became a reality. He wasn't a prepper by any means, but he watched the shows. He would occasionally buy the dried food deals at the local buy marts, not because of the apocalypse, but because of the fear. Better yet, the concern of the giant earthquake just waiting to hit the Pacific Northwest. Chris lives in a modest two-story home in the suburbs, which is not in the best neighborhood, but a decent place with decent neighbors. Of course, he had a gun collection. He was an alpha male, and that would be tested soon enough. Little did he know. The local news interrupted the movie he was watching and reported that a virus was spreading and that everyone should stay indoors and avoid contact with people if possible. At that time, his phone rang. It was his brother. "Dude, did you see the news reports? It's happening. All those days of pretending to shoot zombies, now it's real." His brother was younger and an avid camper and hunter, even though he never caught a deer or elk on all his hunting trips. I assume it's because once he had one in his sights, he couldn't end its life. "Dude, what are you gonna do? Do you want to try to meet up with me at our cabin?" The cabin they shared was just on the edge of Mount Hood. "I'm gonna try to make it up there. I hope you take care of yourself, and I love you." At that moment, there was a click. "Mike, are you there? Can you hear me? Hello? Beep, beep." Then, a steady drone and nothing. Chris realized at that moment he was alone. "Godspeed, brother, till we meet again." Chris looked out his second-story window that overlooks the street. It was quiet, except for the random car speeding home. Nothing out of the ordinary yet. Chris went to his gun safe and grabbed his 9mm handgun, holstered it along with a couple extra clips, and took out the Mossberg shotgun and some shells just in case anything went down at night. I was not afraid of the zombies as much as a group trying to rob me for my stuff or shelter. Chris's house sat on a hillside, so there were stairs to his front door and a side entry for the RV that led to the back of his house. The garage was lower than the house, so there were stairs leading up from inside the garage to the entry. His front and garage entry doors were both made of steel, an upgrade he got for free from the manager at Lowe's. Chris chained and bolted the RV gate shut. He then removed the stairs and landing in the garage to make access to the inside entry door harder, and he did the same for his front door. He removed the landing, left the stairs. Both entry doors now sat 8 feet from ground level. He screwed 3/4-inch plywood over the back windows and sliding door, inside and out, 0.4-inch lag screws right through the framing. He installed 2x4s across both the entry doors, even though they were inaccessible. You never know. He thought to himself, better safe them, sorry. Tomorrow, if there is one, I will install whatever fence material I have left from construction jobs to better secure this place. He pulled the attic ladder down, just in case someone got into his house. Then he could escape and hide out there, or stay protected and hidden by whatever was going to be after him. Chris then brought all the dried food, weapons, and ammunition up to the attic. He figured if someone was trying to rob him and got in, he would just get up into the finished attic and figure it out then. He then brought his monitor, which is connected to the wireless cameras around his house. I figure if I get stuck up here, it would be nice to see what's happening outside. The power and water were still running, and they would for a while unless the government turned it all off. As long as the gas stays running, the generator will power the house and keep the Tesla wall charged. During the day, he kept checking his cell phone for a signal, wondering if his brother was okay and if he had made it to the cabin. As night fell, Chris didn't sleep. He kept looking out his windows, observing the streets, waiting for something or someone to come knocking on his doors. Day 2. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Chris's bedroom, casting striped patterns across the floor. He lay in silence for a moment, listening for the hum of normalcy, the sound of cars on the road, children playing, a distant lawnmower. Instead, there was nothing. Just an eerie, oppressive stillness, occasionally interrupted by the faint rustle of wind or the muted sound of a distant scream. Chris sat up, his heart heavy with unease. The previous night's events played through his mind, the news reports, the strange call from his brother, and the surreal reality of what the world had become. Walking to his window, he pulled back the curtain and scanned the street. Several cars sat parked askew, doors left ajar, and groceries spilled onto driveways. One vehicle sat in the middle of the street, its hazard lights blinking uselessly. Then he saw it, a figure staggering aimlessly down the road. His stomach knotted. The figure was a neighbor, Mr. Harlan, an older man who lived 3 houses down, or at least it had been Mr. Harlan. The way he moved, jerking and shuffling, was unnatural. His clothes were smeared with something dark and wet. Chris squinted, his breath hitching as he realized Mr. Harlan's lower jaw was missing, exposing a grotesque stretch of flesh and broken teeth. Chris backed away from the window, his mind racing. He felt a surge of adrenaline as he hurried to his gun safe. Opening it, he retrieved his .30-30 lever-action rifle, a reliable hunting gun his father had passed down. He loaded it methodically, his hands trembling slightly, then stepped back to the window. Raising the rifle to his shoulder, he peered through the scope. Mr. Harlan was closer now, his hollow eyes fixed on nothing. Chris steadied his breathing and focused on the head like he'd practiced countless times on paper targets. He squeezed the trigger. Bang! The shot echoed down the quiet street, shattering the eerie stillness. Through the scope, Chris watched as the bullet hit its mark, exploding the zombie's head in a spray of dark red and bone fragments. The body crumpled to the pavement, twitching once before going still. Chris lowered the rifle, his hands slick with sweat. His stomach churned. Killing an undead creature felt disturbingly different than target practice. The gruesome reality of it made him want to vomit, but there was no time for that. He knew this wouldn't be the last. After the initial shock, Chris paced his living room, thinking through his next steps. He couldn't rely solely on the steel doors and plywood reinforcements he'd added yesterday. Zombies weren't the only threat. Looters or desperate survivors could appear anytime. His house sat on a hillside, with the garage on the lower level and the main house elevated above. While the stairs and landings had been removed, he needed another layer of defense to create a true stronghold. Chris wondered if his neighbors next to him were still there, or what they were doing. He went to the neighbor Mike, a great friend of his, and he noticed their Subaru was gone. He knocked on the door, standing to the side of, in case someone just started shooting through the door. No answer. No lights were on, no noise from inside. He then went to his other neighbor Tom. Same thing. All their off-road vehicles gone. Just their Tercel sat in the driveway. He was alone, other than the zombies that roamed the area. He needed to add more security to his house then. The idea hit him like a bolt of lightning, a chain-link fence. He'd worked with fencing materials countless times as a contractor. He had extra rolls stored in his backyard from a recent job. It wasn't perfect, but it would provide a visible barrier and buy him precious seconds in case of an attack. Chris grabbed his work gloves, utility belt, and cordless drill. Heading to the backyard, he surveyed the fencing materials. There were enough rolls to cover the front yard, and the posts would be easy enough to drive into the soft soil. He'd have to work quickly, though. Every second spent outside increased the risk of an encounter. Chris carried the first section of fencing to the front yard. The street was unnervingly quiet, except for the occasional faint hum of the breeze. He kept his rifle slung over his shoulder and his handgun holstered at his side, scanning the area constantly as he worked. Using a post driver, he hammered the first pole into the ground at the edge of his property. The rhythmic clang of metal on metal echoed loudly, making him flinch and glance nervously up and down the street. He worked faster, securing the first fencing panel to the post, with brace brackets and bolts. Sweat dripped down his face as he moved to the next section. As he worked, he thought about his brother, Mike, and his parting words. "Godspeed, brother, till we meet again." Chris wondered if Mike was safe or if he was out there somewhere, fighting for his life. When Chris installed half the fence, the sun was high in the sky. He paused to drink water from a canteen, his muscles aching. That's when he heard a faint, low growl coming from his left. Slowly, he turned his head and saw another zombie stumbling toward him from the direction of the abandoned car in the street. "Damn it," Chris muttered, unslinging the rifle. He aimed quickly, unwilling to let the creature get too close. The shot rang out, and the zombie crumpled to the ground, lifeless. Chris didn't linger to admire his aim. He hurriedly finished securing the remaining panels, his heart pounding with every bolt he tightened. By the time the fence was complete, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard. Chris inspected his work. The fence stood tall and secure, creating a perimeter extending across his house's front and connected to the RV gate. It wouldn't stop a determined group, but slow them down. He retreated inside, locking the steel door behind him. In the kitchen, he heated a can of chili on the stove, his mind replaying the day's events. The image of Mr. Harlan's shattered head lingered, along with the thought of the other zombie he'd killed near the car. These weren't just monsters, they had been people once. Neighbors, friends. Chris forced the thoughts aside as he ate, focusing instead on the steps he would take tomorrow. He needed to figure out how to contact other survivors if there were any. The radio he'd scavenged still picked up faint static but no voices. As darkness fell, Chris climbed to the second-story window with his rifle. He sat in a chair, peering out over the street. The chain-link fence glinted faintly in the moonlight, a small comfort in the face of the unknown. Every creak of the house and rustle of wind made him tense, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the occasional groan of a zombie in the distance. Chris's eyes grew heavy, but he refused to let himself sleep. Not yet. Not until he was confident his home was secure. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for tonight, Chris allowed himself a small measure of pride. The fence was up, the house was fortified, and he was still alive. Day 3. The sun had barely risen over the hazy Portland skyline, its weak rays filtered by a thin fog that had settled like a shroud over the area. Chris opened his bedroom window, breathing in the cool, crisp air. It was eerily silent, no birds chirping, no distant hum of cars, just the occasional creak of his home settling into the hillside. The quiet gnawed at him, amplifying the weight of his isolation. He glanced at his phone. No signal. The small comfort of connection, even a glimmer of it, had vanished. With a resigned sigh, he tossed it onto the nightstand. He turned his attention to the flashing panel of his Generac generator. The blinking light confirmed what he knew. The house ran on borrowed time. The realization hit him with a grim finality. No power, no water. 3 days into the apocalypse, the systems he'd taken for granted were failing. He checked the tap, nothing but the hollow gurgle of air. It wasn't unexpected, but it still sent a jolt of anxiety through him. Chris ran his fingers through his disheveled hair, calculating his remaining resources. The propane feeding his generator would last about a week if he rationed power carefully, maybe 2 if he cut down usage drastically. But the water, that was a bigger problem. He had 10 gallons of drinking water stashed away, enough for 10 days if he stuck to a gallon a day. The gutters fed his catch cans in the backyard, providing murky rainwater for non-drinking needs. Still, it wouldn't last long without rainfall. "I need to figure out how to keep the power going," Chris muttered, pacing. His mind wandered to solar panels, something he'd always meant to install but never got around to. Regret twisted in his gut. And water, I need more water. Chris sat in front of the second-story window, rifle resting across his lap, and stared out at the lifeless street below. His thoughts spiraled. It's day 3. I'm all alone. No one to talk to. His brother Mike was out there somewhere, hopefully alive. Still, the grim possibility that Mike had become one of the undead lingered in the back of his mind. For the first time in his life, Chris felt utterly untethered. His skills as a contractor and his modest stockpile of supplies had kept him afloat so far. Still, The emotional toll of solitude was heavier than he'd anticipated. The generator's hum provided a strange comfort, but was also a problem. It had started attracting unwanted attention. From his vantage point, Chris noticed the zombies first as shadows emerging from the fog. Slowly, their shambling forms moved toward his makeshift chain-link fence. By mid-morning, 3 were pressed against the barrier, their decaying fingers stretching through the links. Their low, guttural groans blended with the generator's hum, creating a nerve-wracking soundtrack to his morning. "I need to take care of this before it gets out of hand," Chris said aloud, his voice breaking the oppressive silence. He pushed away the unease clawing at his chest and focused on the immediate task. Chris descended into the garage using a ladder he'd rigged after removing the stairs. He grabbed his pickaxe, the tool's weight familiar in his hands. The garage door groaned as he opened it, and a blast of cool morning air rushed in, carrying with it the nauseating stench of rot. He stepped outside cautiously, scanning his surroundings. The fog muted everything, making it feel like he was walking into a dream or a nightmare. The zombies at the fence turned toward him, their milky eyes locking onto his movement. They groaned louder, their fingers clawing the air as if desperate to close the distance between them. Chris approached the fence with measured steps, the pickaxe gripped tightly in his hands. The first zombie, a middle-aged man with half his face missing, lunged as far as the chain-link barrier would allow. Chris swung the pickaxe precisely, the pointed end smashing into the creature's forehead. The body slumped to the ground, lifeless. The second zombie, a woman in tattered pajamas, reached for him with skeletal hands. Chris stepped closer and swung again, the tool connecting with a sickening crunch. Blood and decayed tissue splattered across the fence as the body fell limp. When he reached the third zombie, his stomach churned from the stench. He hesitated, the weight of what he was doing sinking in. These had been people once, neighbors, perhaps even friends. But hesitation could get him killed. He swung the pickaxe one last time, and the final zombie crumpled. Chris leaned against the fence, panting, the metallic tang of blood thick in the air. He wiped his face with his sleeve and surveyed the damage. The ground outside the fence was littered with motionless bodies. "Okay," he muttered to himself, "enough daydreaming. I better get back inside before I attract more of them." Once inside, Chris washed his hands in the murky rainwater from the catch can. The task was menial, but it helped steady his nerves. He knew the fence had done its job, but it wouldn't hold against a larger group, or something more intelligent than a zombie. He spent the next several hours reinforcing it. Using leftover fencing materials from his contracting work, he added an extra layer to the barrier, making it taller and more secure. He also rigged a makeshift alarm system using fishing lines and small metal cans, which would rattle loudly if disturbed. By the time he finished, the sun was high and the fog had burned away, leaving the street bathed in a cold, harsh light. The fence looked solid, but Chris couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a temporary solution. As the day wore on, Chris retreated to the house to assess his resources again. The generator hummed steadily, but the sound felt more ominous than comforting. He debated turning it off at night to conserve propane and avoid attracting more zombies. Still, the idea of sitting in total darkness unnerved him. He ate a small portion of dried food for dinner, washing it down with a cup of rainwater he'd filtered through a coffee filter, thinking it best to preserve the fresh water for the future. The meal was bland and unsatisfying, but it was fuel. 10 more days of this, he muttered, staring at the nearly empty plate. I need a better plan. That night, as the generator continued its steady drone, Chris watched from the second-story window. The chain-link fence, illuminated faintly by the moonlight, stood as his last line of defense. Shadows moved in the distance, too far to identify but close enough to keep him on edge. Chris thought of his brother again, wondering if he was safe, or if he'd become one of the monsters now stalking the streets. The thought tightened his chest, but he forced it aside. Survive now, think later, he reminded himself. Day 3 ended with Chris staring into the darkness, his mind restless despite exhaustion. The zombies had tested his fence today, and he knew it was only a matter of time before they, or something worse, tested it again. The generator's hum was both a blessing, a curse, a lifeline, and a beacon. Day 4, Chris woke to the sound of groans, louder and closer than before. His eyes snapped open, his heart pounding as he sat in bed. The faint, steady hum of the generator was still audible. Still, it was drowned out by the ominous chorus of undead voices outside. He rushed to his second-story window, his stomach tightening at the sight below. His last line of defense, the chain-link fence, was bowing under the sheer weight of zombies pressing against it. Their decayed hands clawed at the metal, their rotting bodies piling against each other. The barricade that had seemed so sturdy yesterday was now visibly failing, the posts bending and shifting with every passing second. Chris panicked. What do I do? His thoughts raced as he grabbed his rifle and headed downstairs, his bare feet thudding against the hardwood floor. At the front door, he paused, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The fence was holding for now, but it wouldn't for long. He had to act. Grabbing the pickaxe he'd left by the door, Chris steeled himself. I have to thin them out. It's the only way. The moment he opened the door, the smell hit him, a pungent mix of rot and death that made his stomach churn. The cool morning air was thick with the stench, but there was no time to dwell on it. Chris sprinted toward the fence, the pickaxe gripped tightly in his hands. The first swing came down hard, the pointed end of the pickaxe piercing through the skull of a zombie. It collapsed immediately, its weight slumping against the fence. Chris didn't stop. He swung again, then again, each strike accompanied by a sickening crunch. The groans of the undead were deafening, their movements relentless as more shuffled forward to fill the gaps left by their fallen counterparts. Hours passed in a blur of sweat and gore. Chris's arms burned with exhaustion, his muscles cramping as he continued to fight. Each zombie he killed added to the grisly pile at the base of the fence. Their bodies formed a grotesque barrier, reinforcing the weakened chain-link structure and giving him a temporary reprieve. When the sun was high, Chris could barely lift the pickaxe. He leaned against the fence, gasping for breath, his clothes soaked with sweat and streaked with blood. The groans of the undead had quieted, but only because so many lay motionless in the dirt. The fence held for now, bolstered by the macabre line of corpses. I can't keep doing this, Chris muttered to himself. His voice was hoarse, his hands trembling. I need another plan. Back inside, Chris washed his hands with rainwater, the liquid cool and refreshing against his blistered skin. He glanced at the generator panel, its lights blinking steadily. The machine had been his lifeline, providing power for lights, cooking, and even the comforting white noise of modern technology. But now it was a liability. The constant hum had drawn the horde to his home, and if he kept it running, it would only get worse. Chris stood before the generator, his finger hovering over the power button. Turning it off felt like severing his last connection to the world before. It meant giving up refrigeration, lighting, and the illusion of normalcy. But he had no choice. The zombies were relentless, and the noise was their beacon. With a deep breath, he pressed the button. The generator powered down with a low whine, leaving the house eerily silent. Chris stared at it momentarily, feeling the weight of his decision settle over him. There goes the last bit of modern life, he muttered. Now this place is just an overpriced camper. Chris spent the afternoon sitting at the kitchen table, eating some dried food and sipping from a water bottle. The silence in the house was oppressive, broken only by the occasional groan from outside. He stared at the wall, his thoughts drifting to the life he'd taken for granted just days ago. You don't realize how good you have it until it's all gone, he said aloud. The words hung in the air, unanswered, reminding him how alone he was. The house felt emptier than ever. No phone calls, no emails, no laughter or conversation. Just him and the hum of his thoughts. For the first time, Chris allowed himself to think about the future, or the lack of it. What happens when the food runs out? When the water's gone? When I'm too tired to fight? He shook his head, trying to push the thoughts away. Dwelling on them wouldn't help. Survival was about action, not despair. After finishing his meal, Chris pulled out his hand-cranked radio. It was a relic from his camping days, something he'd tossed into his emergency kit without much thought. Now it was his only connection to the outside world. He cranked the handle until the device crackled to life, the static a small comfort in the quiet house. Slowly he turned the dial, searching for a signal, anything. A voice. A message. a sign that someone out there was still alive, but there was nothing. Just static, broken occasionally by faint, unintelligible noises that could have been voices or interference. Chris slumped back in his chair, the radio resting on the table before him. "Figures," he said bitterly. "The government isn't here for us. They can't help us. We're alone." The thought hung heavy in the air. For all he knew, the entire world was gone, either dead or turned into one of the shambling monsters outside. The weight of that realization pressed down on him, threatening to suffocate. The light outside faded as the day wore on, casting long shadows across the house. Chris sat by the window, his rifle resting on the sill, as he watched for movement. The fence had held up well enough after the morning's battle, but he knew it wouldn't last forever. The undead groans grew louder as the darkness deepened, their silhouettes barely visible in the faint moonlight. Chris tightened his grip on the rifle, eyes scanning the yard for any breaches. The house's silence felt oppressive, amplifying every creak of the floorboards, every distant noise outside. 3 days, he muttered to himself. 3 days, and no sign of life, just the shuffling dead. For a moment he allowed himself to hope, just a flicker, that Mike was still alive and fighting. But the hope was fleeting, drowned out by the grim reality of his situation. He was alone, and there was no guarantee anyone else had survived. As the hours dragged on, Chris stayed by the window, the rifle steady in his hands. The weight of exhaustion pressed against him, but he refused to sleep. The world outside was too dangerous, too uncertain. His survival depended on his vigilance. Day 5. The morning air was heavy and thick with the acrid smell of smoke. Chris sat at his second-story window, rifle resting across his lap, as he stared down the street. Flames roared from a house 2 blocks away, the orange glow flickering in the smoky morning light. The fire crackled loudly, consuming the structure with an unsettling speed. It wasn't just the fire that made him uneasy, it was the movement it attracted. Zombies shuffled toward the inferno, drawn by the light and noise. For a brief moment, Chris felt a grim sense of relief. "At least they're not paying attention to me," he muttered. But his relief was short-lived as he noticed something else. The houses next to the burning one were starting to catch fire. Their vinyl siding bubbled and melted, and small flames soon danced along their roof's edges. "Damn it," Chris growled, his pulse quickening. He knew the neighborhood well and the fire codes, or the lack of them. The homes were built just 10 feet apart. If the fire spread, it wouldn't stop until the entire block was engulfed. His house, perched on the hillside, might be spared from the initial flames, but the smoke and heat would be unavoidable. Over the next hour, the fire spread rapidly, leaping from house to house like a living thing. The air thickened with smoke, turning the morning sun into a faint orange ball barely visible through the haze. Ash began to fall like snow, coating everything in a gray-white layer. Chris watched from his window as more zombies stumbled toward the flames, their grotesque forms silhouetted against the growing inferno. He closed the window, coughing as the smell of burning wood and plastic seeped inside. The smoke irritated his eyes, making them water. Chris knew he needed to act. If the fire reached his house, his fortifications wouldn't matter. Everything would go up in flames. Chris walked downstairs to the kitchen, his mind racing. He tried to focus on something manageable: food. He opened the fridge and surveyed the contents. Most of the perishables were still good, the cold air lingering after a full day without power. But it wouldn't last much longer. He decided to make use of the propane barbecue on his back deck. The freezer still had a bag of hamburger patties left over from a 4th of July cookout and some frozen vegetables. "Might as well make a feast out of it," he muttered, trying to inject some humor into the grim situation. Outside, the ashfall coated his deck in a fine layer of soot. Chris brushed it away and fired up the grill. The sizzle of the patties hitting the hot surface was oddly comforting, a small semblance of normalcy in a world that had gone mad. The smell of cooking meat wafted through the air, momentarily overpowering the stench of smoke and rot. He knew it might attract attention, but at this point, everything did. As the burgers cooked, Chris made a mental inventory of his supplies. The fridge's remaining contents were a mix of usable and spoiled food. He decided to clear it out entirely. Better to toss what he couldn't use now than to let it rot and make the house unlivable. After his meal, he spent the next hour cleaning out the fridge, throwing spoiled milk, soggy vegetables, and anything questionable into a trash bag. He double-bagged it and set it by the garage door, deciding to deal with disposal later. By midday, the fires had consumed half the neighborhood. The smoke outside was so thick it turned the sky an eerie shade of gray, blotting out the sun entirely. The falling ash grew heavier, settling on the fence, and the zombie corpses piled around it. The temperature inside the house began to climb, the fire's heat radiating through the air. Chris knew he couldn't open the windows without filling his home with smoke. Still, the lack of ventilation made the atmosphere inside stifling. He set up a makeshift fan using one of his battery-powered tools, cutting strips of cardboard to direct airflow. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Every hour, he took small sips of water, rationing it carefully. With each passing moment, the realization grew heavier in his mind. If this fire didn't stop soon, he'd be forced to leave. After securing his home from the smoke the best he could, Chris pulled out his hand-cranked radio again. The previous day's attempts to find a signal had been fruitless, but he couldn't shake the need to try. He cranked the handle until the device buzzed faintly, then turned the dial slowly, listening for anything other than static. This time, he heard something, a faint, crackling voice. His heart leapt as he adjusted the dial, trying to make out the words. Emergency, shelters, located danger zones, avoid major highways. The voice cut in and out, barely audible over the static, but it was enough to ignite a spark of hope. He scribbled down what he could catch, mentions of emergency shelters and warnings to avoid highways. The broadcast repeated a few times before fading into static again. Chris sat back, staring at the scribbled notes. Emergency shelters, he murmured. So there's still some kind of organization out there. Someone's trying to help. But the message also brought a new kind of fear. If people were being directed to shelters, those places would be overrun, by survivors and zombies alike. Was leaving his fortified home worth the risk and heading into the unknown? As night began to fall, Chris made his rounds, checking the barricades and the perimeter. The fire had slowed but was still burning a few blocks away. The zombies near his fence had thinned out, drawn to the noise and flames. The fence itself, though still standing, showed signs of wear. The metal was warped from the previous horde, and parts were slick with ash and gore. Chris spent the evening reinforcing the barricades, using whatever materials he could scavenge from the garage. He secured the plywood over the windows with extra screws and reinforced the door braces. He wanted to be ready if the fire reached his home or another wave of zombies came. By the time Chris finally sat down, it was well past midnight. The house was quiet. The only sound was the faint crackle of distant flames and the occasional groan from outside. He stared at the hand-cranked radio on the table, his notes beside it. The idea of finding a shelter gnawed at him. Staying put felt safer, but it also felt like delaying the inevitable. Supplies were finite, and the fire had proven his home wasn't as secure as he'd hoped. As he leaned back in his chair, Chris thought about his brother again. Mike wouldn't have gone to a shelter, he reasoned. He knew his brother didn't trust the government and would do what he had to stay clear of them. The thought both comforted and terrified him. For now, though, he needed sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. He'd need every ounce of strength to face them. The fire might still spread, the zombies might return, and whether to stay or go would only grow louder in his mind. Chris lay on the couch, rifle within arm's reach, and closed his eyes. The house creaked around him, and the faint orange glow of the fires outside painted the walls in unsettling patterns. Chris drifted into a restless sleep as the world burned, haunted by dreams of smoke, ash, and the shuffling dead. Day 6. Chris jolted awake, his heart racing. A sound had pierced through the eerie silence of the night, the unmistakable hum of a vehicle engine. He sat upright, gripping the rifle he'd kept by his side. For a moment, he thought he might be dreaming. Then he heard loud voices, the clatter of tools, and the sharp bang of something metal hitting the pavement. He scrambled to the second-story window and cautiously peeked out. A group of people, armed and organized, was prowling the neighborhood. They moved purposefully, breaking into houses near the burned block, their flashlights cutting through the smoky darkness. From his vantage point, Chris counted at least 6 men, all armed with rifles or shotguns slung across their backs. Jesus, Chris muttered under his breath, his stomach sinking. Out of all the neighborhoods in the city, they pick mine? Just my luck. The group wasn't subtle. They smashed windows, kicked in doors, and shouted instructions to one another. As Chris watched, his mind raced. They weren't just looters, they were predators, methodical and efficient. They knew exactly what they were doing. Chris's stomach churned as he watched the men approach his fence. Their flashlights scanned the makeshift barrier lingering on the corpses of the zombies he'd killed the day before. One man laughed, gesturing to the line of bodies as if it were a joke. "Looks like someone's got a little fort going," one shouted. Another man, stocky and carrying a crowbar, stepped closer and kicked the base of the fence. The chain link rattled but held firm. "Fortress or not, this guy's got supplies. Look at this place, it's intact. Bet he's got food, water, maybe even power." Chris gritted his teeth. His grip on the rifle tightened as he considered his options. He could fire a warning shot, but that would reveal his position. Worse, it could provoke them into attacking. For now, he decided to wait and watch. After a few minutes of testing the fence and muttering, the group moved on to easier targets. They broke into a house further down the street, the sounds of smashing glass and shouting fading into the distance. Chris let out a shaky breath and stepped away from the window. The reprieve felt temporary. "They'll be back," he muttered. He had seen how they'd looked at his house, the barricaded windows and fortified fence. His home was a prize, and they wouldn't forget it. He climbed the ladder to the attic, where he'd moved most of his supplies and weapons. Opening the gun safe, he grabbed his AR-15, along with several loaded magazines. The sleek, black rifle felt reassuring, a reminder of his countless hours at the range. This wasn't a paper target, though. These were real, armed, and dangerous people. He holstered his handgun, slung the .30-30 lever-action rifle over his shoulder, and kept the AR in hand. His heart pounded as he returned to his post at the window, keeping a watchful eye on the street. As the night stretched on and the looters continued their rampage in the distance, Chris took stock of his supplies. The dried food wasn't a problem for now, but water was a different story. His 10-gallon supply had dwindled to almost nothing. Without water, he couldn't cook the dried meals or stay hydrated. The gutters had collected some rainwater during the last storm, but it wasn't drinkable without proper filtration. His homemade filter, coffee filters layered with charcoal, was a short-term solution at best. The reality was sinking in. He wouldn't survive another week if he didn't secure a reliable water source soon. It was past midnight when the noise returned. Chris, who had dozed off in a chair by the window, woke to a low rumble outside. This time, the looters weren't trying to be subtle. Peering through the blinds, Chris saw their vehicle idling in the street. The men were back, and they were better prepared. Chains gleamed in the moonlight as they hooked them to the base of the fence. Chris's heart sank. They're going to rip it down. He could hear them talking, their voices carrying through the still night. "Let's pull this sucker down and see what we've got," one of them said. "Bet he's armed," another replied. "Doesn't matter. 6 against 1, he's done." Chris's hands trembled as he loaded a magazine into the AR-15 and chambered a round. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. He hadn't wanted it to come to this, but he wasn't about to let them take everything he'd fought to protect. As the first man climbed over the fence, Chris opened fire. The AR-15 cracked sharply, the sound echoing through the neighborhood. The first shot hit the man in the chest, knocking him back into the dirt. Chris didn't hesitate, aiming at the following figure, fumbling with the chain. A second shot, this time a headshot, dropped him instantly. The remaining men scattered, taking cover behind the vehicle and nearby debris. Chris kept firing in short bursts, the .223 Remington rounds tearing through the night. His aim was methodical, honed by years of practice. One by one, the looters fell, their shouts of panic replaced by silence. Within minutes, it was over. Chris lowered the rifle, his chest heaving as he scanned the street. The bodies lay scattered near the fence, the vehicle idling quietly in the background. He kept his finger on the trigger, waiting to see if anyone else would appear. The silence that followed was almost more unnerving than the fight itself. Chris stepped outside cautiously, his rifle at the ready. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the ever-present decay stench created a nauseating blend. He walked to the fence, looking at the bodies, observing each one to make sure they weren't playing dead. They weren't. Chris looked down at the men he'd killed, a cold knot forming in his stomach. They'd been dangerous, no doubt about it, but they were still human. He hadn't had a choice. He'd done what he needed to do to survive, but the weight of it settled on him nonetheless. Back inside, Chris sat at the kitchen table, the rifle resting across his lap. His hands shook as he drank from the canteen, the cool water soothing his parched throat. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving him drained and numb. He thought about the men he'd killed, the way they'd come for him without hesitation. This was the world now, a place where survival meant taking lives before they took yours. There was no law, no order, no safety net, just him, his guns, and his will to survive. As dawn broke, Chris stood by the window, watching the smoke rise from the burned-out homes down the street. The bodies of the looters lay where they'd fallen, a grim warning to anyone else who might think about testing his defenses. Day 6 ended with Chris alive, his home intact, and his resolve hardened. The world outside might be burning, but he wasn't going anywhere as long as he had breath in his lungs and a gun in his hands. Day 7, Chris leaned against his kitchen counter, staring at the meager remnants of his water supply. The realization weighed heavy. Staying here wasn't an option anymore. The fenced fortress he had painstakingly maintained over the past 6 days had kept him alive, but it couldn't last forever. Supplies were dwindling, and the threat of another attack, either by the dead or the living, was too great. He needed a new plan, and he needed it now. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, thinking of his brother Mike. "Please be okay," Chris whispered. Mike had mentioned heading to the family cabin at Mount Hood before their call had cut off. It was remote, stocked with supplies, and defensible. A perfect place to wait out the apocalypse. Chris had to know if Mike had made it there. It was his only hope for reunion, survival, and anything resembling a future. Chris spent the morning methodically gathering everything he could carry. He opened the attic, carefully removing his collection of guns and ammo, and laid them out like an arsenal ready for war. His AR-15, 30-30 lever-action rifle, Mossberg shotgun, and trusty 9mm handgun all made the cut. He packed every loaded magazine, stuffing them into duffel bags alongside spare ammo boxes. Next came the food, vacuum-sealed dried meals, canned goods, and little bottled water. Chris packed a small propane stove and a hand-cranked radio. Clothing and medical supplies followed, anything he thought he might need if the trip to the cabin turned into something longer. His lifted F-350 sat in the driveway, a rugged testament to his years as a contractor. It was a beast of a truck, capable of handling rough terrain and whatever obstacles the road might throw at him. Chris began loading the supplies into the bed and cab, securing everything with bungee cords and tarps. As he worked, the weight of the task ahead gnawed at him. The cabin was a 45-minute drive in the best of times, but now, with the world in shambles, roads might be blocked, towns overrun, or worse, inhabited by hostile survivors. Before leaving, Chris needed to ensure his departure wouldn't be hindered. He grabbed his AR-15 and stepped outside. The cool morning air was heavy with the familiar stench of decay. Zombies lingered at the edge of his property, drawn by the previous night's firefight sounds. Chris scanned the area, counting at least a dozen shambling figures within 100 feet of his fence. "Can't leave them wandering around here," he muttered, raising the rifle. He took them down one by one, each shot precise and controlled. The bodies fell where they stood, creating a macabre perimeter of stillness. With the area clear, Chris dismantled the fence that had kept him safe for nearly a week. Each section of the chain link and every makeshift reinforcement came down methodically. The act felt bittersweet. The fence had been his first line of defense, his sanctuary, but now it was just a relic of a fight he couldn't afford to keep waging. Chris climbed into the truck, the driver's seat familiar and oddly comforting. He inserted the key, and the diesel engine roared to life, the low rumble breaking the uneasy silence of the morning. He glanced at his house one last time through the rearview mirror as he pulled out of the driveway. It felt strange to leave it behind, but he knew staying would mean certain death. The streets were eerily quiet as he navigated through the neighborhood. Smoke still lingered in the air from the fires that had ravaged nearby homes, and the ash-covered streets bore the marks of chaos: abandoned cars, shattered glass, and the occasional crumpled body. Chris tightened his grip on the wheel, his mind focused on the journey ahead. Reaching Highway 26 felt like crossing a threshold into the unknown. The once bustling road was now a ghostly expanse, littered with abandoned vehicles and debris. Chris weaved around the wreckage cautiously, his eyes scanning for any signs of movement. As he approached the outskirts of Sandy, a small town nestled along the highway, his chest tightened. Sandy had always been a peaceful place, a gateway to the mountain. But now, it was a potential death trap. Chris slowed the truck, lowering the window slightly to listen. The town was unnervingly quiet, but the stillness didn't feel safe. It felt like a trap. He decided not to stop, keeping the truck moving at a steady pace. The fewer encounters, the better. As he drove through the town, he caught glimpses of broken storefronts, overturned shopping carts, and bloodstains on the pavement. Every shadow felt like it was watching him, every corner a potential ambush. Chris was halfway through Sandy when he spotted movement ahead. A group of people standing in the middle of the road, waving their arms. They were shouting, their voices desperate and frantic. "No way," he muttered, gripping the wheel tightly. He'd seen enough movies and enough of the real world over the past week to know this could be a setup. He pressed the accelerator, the truck's engine growling as it surged forward. The group scattered, shouting angrily as he sped past them. In the rearview mirror, Chris saw one raise a rifle and fire. The shot cracked through the air. "Shit!" Chris growled, ducking instinctively. He kept driving, not daring to stop until clear of the town. When he finally felt safe enough to pull over, Chris inspected the truck. A bullet had grazed the tailgate, leaving a shallow dent. He exhaled sharply, his pulse still racing. "Guess that answers how many bad people are out here," he muttered grimly. The drive past the smaller towns was less eventful but no less tense. The sparse populations had likely been hit hard by the outbreak, leaving little behind except empty streets and the occasional wandering zombie. Chris kept his speed steady, weaving around obstacles and staying alert. The farther he drove, the quieter it became. The silence felt heavier out here, the weight of isolation pressing down on him. For the first time, he questioned whether the cabin would be safe, or if Mike would be there. As Chris neared the cabin's turnoff, the landscape changed. The dense forests of Mount Hood loomed on either side of the road, their towering evergreens casting long shadows across the pavement. The air was cooler and fresher here, a welcome reprieve from the smoke-filled city. The road to the cabin was unpaved, a bumpy dirt path that wound through the trees. Chris slowed the truck, his nerves on edge. The isolation of the area was both comforting and unnerving. If something went wrong out here, no one would come to help. When the cabin came into view, Chris felt a surge of relief. The small wooden structure looked intact, its windows shuttered, and its front porch clear. But there was no sign of Mike. Chris parked the truck a safe distance away and cut the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. He grabbed his rifle and stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Mike?" he called, his voice echoing through the trees. No answer. Cautiously, Chris approached the cabin, his rifle raised. The door was locked, but the key hidden under a loose floorboard on the porch was still there. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, his heart pounding. The cabin was exactly as he remembered, simple, rustic, and functional. Supplies were neatly stored in cabinets, and the fireplace was clean, as if waiting to be used. But there was no sign of Mike. Chris set down his gear and sank into a chair, the day's weight settling over him. He'd made it to the cabin, but the one thing he'd hoped for, the reunion with his brother, remained elusive. He stared out the window at the forest beyond, his thoughts a whirlwind of fear and hope. Was Mike still out there? Had he made it somewhere else? Or had he become one of the shambling dead, lost to this nightmare forever? For now, the cabin was safe. But Chris knew his journey wasn't over. If Mike wasn't here, he'd have to decide where to go next. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. He wasn't giving up. Not yet. Chris leaned back in the chair, gripping his rifle tightly. The sun dipped behind the trees, casting the cabin in shadows as another long night began.